Hello, let's jump right in there, shall we? With this explanation in her mind, she let herself relax again on her pillows and closed her eyes, pressing the hand that held her own in a confiding and trusting clasp. It was Matt himself who broke this silence at last. Also, I just noticed it's spelled M-A-T, Matt, not M-A-T-T. I've been thinking a great deal lately, Nell, he said, about this grand consecration day of the mayor's. It's to be in January, they tell me now, and I hear the wildest tales as they go about among my people as to what the man is planning. He sighed heavily as he spoke, and Nell took the opportunity of repossessing herself of her right hand, which she promptly made use of to pull her blue robe more tightly about her. Deeply had Matt Decker sighed when he spoke of the mayors of Glastonbury, and the girl in her maternal atrophy of the sex nerve, and put the sigh down entirely to the delicate professional problem of how to deal with Mr. Gaird's wild and fantastic schemes. But of course, in reality, not much than a thousandth part of this heavy sigh had anything to do with Mr. Gaird's activities. They were interrupted by the appearance of Zookie Pippard, who came to tell them that all the other guests had duly arrived, and that his lordship was growing impatient for the ceremony to begin. This is the christening, you'll remember. One of couples' christenings. Zookie approached the cradle, and Matt Decker stood up. "I hope this isn't the first time, Zookie," said the priest with a kindly chuckle. He was always a transformed man when he dealt with a native born, a touch of the old quaint accent entering, so to speak, his very manner as well as his intonation. "You'll have heard me say a prayer since, but us wasn't let the missus know how well we know each other, shall us?" Under normal conditions, this indulgent indiscretion, referring to an occasion when the worthy man had rescued his tricky old baggage from the clutches of Mistress Shepherd, would have met with a roguish retort. But the naughty old woman was still smarting from Nell's anger over Eudoxia. "His lordship said to her ladyship just now," Mrs. Pippard retorted, humming and murmuring over the baby and giving its tiny red cheeks a fillip with her fingernail. "What be Dr. Dickel doing upstairs? He be a baptizing of she?" "Nonsense, Zookie," cried Nell. "Aren't you ashamed to tell such fibs? But you had better go and get ready, Mr. Decker. Tell them Zookie and I will bring Henry down in less than 5 minutes." And so she said her must go. And Doxy and Mister would be but pleased for she to go her own self. These exciting words echoed through the kitchen of White Lake Cottage half an hour later, when the christening was well over and the upper-class portion of its audience was having their tea in the parlor. "She shouldn't have spoke up like that," said Nancy Stickles reproachably, putting down a great piece of new bread and black currant jam. That sounds good. For they were all squarely seated round the kitchen table and looking with a straight open gaze into the equivocal face of Zookie. "After all, it weren't nice for Mr. Zorland to be taken to she on sofa in parlor, like you say he were, and she in bed with Master Henry, and house all hushed and still." I gotta figure out what's going on here. So is she talking about Zoyland and the girl he was seeing? I guess that's what she's talking about. I don't know. If you can clear it up for me, let me know. "Will you have another piece of sponge cake, Auntie Leg?" threw in the hospitable Zookie. "Us all do know how spectable and proper you be, Nancy Stickles, when all the town knows of how Red Robinson was turned out of house by your Harry because of the fuss you made of it, and the clipping and coiling that went on when your Harry was to bed. I do know for sure how 'twere because Mr. Robinson told me of it, his own self. It was at this point that Abel Twig broke in, interrupting this altercation among the women with such a quavering, faint voice that it seemed like the voice of philosophy itself, come forth from those old Lake Village mounds. Think Red Robinson was sore, no doubt, when Mistress Nance didn't let us know what I wanted to do, and so I went and cast up this tale again her. Some as thick, dirty prophet scrub did again King Joseph in history. I don't know what the hell he's talking about. There was an uncomfortable silence around the kitchen table. Excuse me. During which the more peacefully inclined among the guests turned to Mother Legg for protection. That great provider of Cyprian pleasures had so far hardly uttered a word. She had kept her eyes fixed upon the door which led into the parlour, a door which had been carried bodily to the cottage from Mark Court and was of excessively thick oak. Don't let them get quarrelling, Auntie, pleaded Tibby Patherton, with her mouth full of buttered scone. Sally Jones asked her voice, Sally Jones added her voice to that of Titty, from whose appearance no one certain would have ever had supposed that a few months ago she was screaming so pitiably from morphia. Now, Titty Petherton is an old lady that John Gerd cured of cancer or something. Mrs. Legg, cried Sally, as if the old procuress were very deaf. Didn't you hear, Mrs. Legg, what Zooky Pippard said to Nance Stickles? The mother of Eudoxia was now slow in defending herself. So Zicky Pippard is the mother of Eudoxia, I believe. And Mrs. Legg runs a brothel. This is like upstairs, downstairs, Upton, whatever, Downton Abbey crap going on now. Auntie be hard of hearing, she threw in spitefully, when her eats her tea with poor folk in kitchen instead of with gentry in parlour. These words hit Mother Legg straight to the heart, for the truth was that the old lady had half thought, when she received the invitation to attend the Zoyland christening, that her place would have been with the gentry rather than with her humble relatives. It was indeed in pensive consideration of this unhappy nuance that the portly lady, though they had given her the only chair that had arms and the only teacup that wasn't a kitchen cup, and had taken care to help her first to every dainty on the table, now stared gravely at this great oaken door, through which the one voice of the people within that was at all articulate, and that only now and again, was the voice of William Zoyland. The other voices were lost in a vague, indistinguishable murmur. Zooky Pippard was among the few women in Glastonbury who ever stood up to the present tenant of Camelot and of my other house. But there was a majestic dignity in the rebuke that the old lady administered now, and an incredible daring, too. She actually got up from her chair, walked to the oaken door, opened it wide enough for a person to fill the whole space, and said with a perfect sang-froid to Nell, Your servant here, ma'am, is unwilling to leave us to look after ourselves. But you must please tell us the moment you need her, for we can get on perfectly well without her. Oh, thank you, Mrs. Legg, thank you very much, cried Nell, half rising from her chair, in that particular flurry of perturbation that young hostesses feel when there are signs of a mutiny below deck. It was the Marquis who saved the situation. Why, if that isn't my old friend from Paradise. They never told me that got you here. Where have you been hiding you? Come over here. Is that all right, Nell? And sit by me. He gave the armchair in which Persephone was seated a little jerk with his finger and thumb. He behaved exactly as if he had been Theodoric the Ostrogoth, patronizing some Harlem at Algiers and indicating by the slightest tap upon his Gothic sword hilt that he would be more amused by the aged storyteller of the tense than by the cleverest young houri. Persephone, as she languidly rose, smiling very sweetly upon Mrs. Legg and extending one of her long arms towards her, gave Lord P one single quick, flashing, steel-piercing glance that not only succeeded in making the old despot feel uncomfortable, but in making him heartily wish her back. So lovely did she look in her anger. She could have stabbed me, the little minx, he thought, and I must see her again, he thought. Once he had settled in the capacious chair, with all her black satin flounces and her voluminous black laces deposited about her, Mother Lugg gazed around her with impenetrable aplomb. Under the protection of my lord, she felt ready to be indulgent to her enemies and more than bountiful to her friends. She even felt she owed something to Zookie Pippard for having been the only one to give her the final prod that had led to this public recognition of her true status in Glastonbury society. "He's be fast asleep, the pretty babe," she remarked now, glancing upwards at the ceiling. "You splashed him well with the holy water, Paston. It put me in mind of me own baptism to see how they drops did trickle over him." There arose at this moment a pressing necessity for more hot water in Nell's best silver teapot, which had been a present from her communist brother. To that brother the young mother looked now, for she noticed that Persephone, in her reactions from the rebuff she had received from my lord, was flirting outrageously with Will. Dave got up with alacrity, opened the thick oak door, and entered the kitchen, allowing a clatter of excited women's voices mingled with the husky bass tones of number one to pour into the parlor. He returned with the kettle and filled up the teapot, which had his sister carefully held out to him across the sunburned wrists and clean Sunday shirt cuffs of the vicar. The door between the two rooms remained open while the transaction went on, and that curious tension that comes over two confronted groups of people, between whom yawns the social gulf, reduced White Lake Cottage to one complete self-conscious silence. It was through the middle of this silence that Dave, like a young doctor walking down a ward of expectant patients, took the kettle back to the kitchen and returned to his place, closing the oak door behind him. "I can't think how we people, he said, can be content to go on with this sort of thing. I suppose there isn't one of us here who casts a thought on all those picks and shovels that are working now over at Wookie, getting out with that tin which nature put into the Mendips for the benefit of everybody. The Mendips." Will Zoyland rolled his amorous blue eyes lazily round from his contemplation of Percy's supple figure and stared at the speaker, who now took his seat by Lady Rachel. A splutter of bullying raillery burst from him before his brain had the wit to think of a good retort. "What's in your name, McAlpatane? If you ask me again, I'll tell you the same." He chanted in an aggravating manner, and then he added, "You and I and the vicar, Dave, my friend, are the only ones here who could use those shovels for 5 minutes. And we couldn't use them, at least I couldn't, for half an hour without being exhausted. What are you going to do about that, eh? There must be division of labor in this world." "But we're not laboring at all," cried Lady Rachel, making room for Dave to take his seat by her side. "Not laboring, Rachel? That's a nice thing to say," cried Zoyland in a great voice, "when I've given up my own single holiday for months to entertain all you people and have a Henry christened. You should see how I work out there, my good child. Why, I've often in their draughty little office, hour after Spear's precious shovelers have gone home to their suppers." He shouted all this so loudly that Dave's answer was made the more effective by its extreme quietness. "We all can't dig, Will. That's true enough. But we'd all dodge if we could. I'd be content if those who did the dirty work got more pay than the rest of us. instead of much less, and being looked down upon by us as well. Well, we'll end it there. Got a little confused there, but I think I know what's going on, more or less. So until next time, good day. Guten Nachten.